I told my mom I'd try to record this. She called me yesterday morning and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm looking over my sermon for tomorrow." And she said, "Oh, really? What are you talking about?" And I said, "Fire and brimstone." And there was a pause. And she said, "You know, I never really quite pictured you doing a fire and brimstone sermon." And I assured her it would be a little different than what she would normally think of. And she asked if I would record it for her. So hopefully it comes out all right. You probably recall I was raised Baptist, and my family moved around quite a bit when I was young. And whenever we'd move, we'd go and visit a few different churches, trying to find one that kind of felt right. And typically, if the pastor gave what they considered a fire and brimstone sermon, thumping on the pulpit and trying to scare everybody away from sinning, they would not go back to that church. And it might surprise you to hear this, but I actually kind of enjoyed those sermons. I found them entertaining. And I confess that I occasionally get the urge to thump on the pulpit. But I don't think it would go over too well with groups like this one, so I generally stop myself. Also, I'm certainly not interested in scaring people onto a path. There's a Pali word, ehipassiko, which means inviting others to come and see for themselves. And that kind of sums up the Buddhist approach to proselytization. The Buddha would just kind of lay out his understanding of things and then let people see for themselves whether or not that path had something to offer. But the Buddha wasn't above delivering what you might consider a fire and brimstone sermon. He had kind of a gift for recognizing what someone needed to hear at a certain time to open his or her wisdom eye. In other words, to open off a part of the mind that was closed off to the reality that they needed to experience. And if doing that required some fiery rhetoric, he was okay with that. So be it. Fire appears quite a bit as a metaphor in Buddhism and in different forms. And brimstone, or at least the hell that it represents, also appears in teachings. Some of these teachings can be kind of difficult to approach. They're a little scary until you get close to them. And like the fire and brimstone sermons of my youth, they could just as easily frighten someone away from the path as bring you toward it. But I found that if you take the time to sit with them, to unpack the meaning, these metaphors will often open up and reveal something important. You might recall that after the Buddha sat beneath the tree at Bodh Gaya and awakened, he then traveled to Sarnath, which is outside of Varanasi near the Ganges. And he laid out the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and some other key Buddhist teachings there. And then after a while, he decided that he would go back toward Bodh Gaya. There were a couple of hermitages there, and there were more than 1,000 ascetics living at these hermitages. And each day these ascetics would perform fire pujas, these ceremonies involving sacred fire. And the Buddha wanted to talk to him about his teachings and see how it was perceived, and he said, they like to do fire pujas? I'll talk to them about fire. And so he delivered a talk that became known as the Fire Sermon, and it's fairly well known. In fact, if you're familiar with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, there's a whole section of that called the Fire Sermon, which actually has very little to do with the Fire Sutra that the Buddha gave, but it was a kind of an allusion to it, an acknowledgement of it. So here's what the Buddha told these hermits, which were, by the way, called matted-haired ascetics. Monks, he said, all is burning. What do I mean when I say all is burning? I mean the eye is burning. Forms are burning. Consciousness is burning. And whatever arises dependent on contact at the eye, whether pleasurable, painful, or neither, that is burning. Burning with what? This is where I could thump on the pulpit if I wanted to. Burning with passion. Burning with anger, burning with delusion, burning with birth, aging, and death, burning with sorrows, lamentations, pains, distresses, and despairs. And likewise, the ear is burning and sounds are burning. The nose is burning and smells are burning. The tongue is burning and flavors are burning. The body is burning, physical sensations are burning. The intellect is burning. Ideas are burning. Consciousness of the intellect is burning, and whatever arises in dependence on contact with the intellect, whether pleasurable, painful, or neither, that too is burning. Burning with the fire of passion, the fire of aversion, the fire of delusion. Burning, I say, with birth, aging, and death, sorrows, lamentations, pains, distresses, despairs. So what is he saying? Well, to Indians in those days, fire was seen as a kind of agitation. It was hot because it was stirred up. It was unsettled. And of course, to burn, is painful. And so he's saying that what we see, phenomena that arise dependent on contact between the mind and the eye, is potentially painful. What we hear, what we taste, touch, and even think is painful if we attach to these things. When we cling to sight, sounds, physical sensations, flavors, and even our own views, we can be setting ourselves up for stress. And he says, seeing this clearly, one grows disenchanted with the eye and the sights. One grows disenchanted with the ear and sounds, with the nose and aromas, with tastes, with sensations. One grows disenchanted with the intellect and ideas, with whatever arises in dependence on the intellect, experiences pleasure, pain, or neither. So in other words, if you stop clinging to things that cause suffering, you stop creating stress. These matted-haired hermits were matted-haired hermits because they were taking on these ascetic practices, looking for release from the cycle of suffering. And so what he was saying is that if you want to do that, if you want this release, you have to stop clinging. Non-clinging is the way to nirvana. And this word nirvana itself is actually more a metaphor than a place or a thing. Literally, nirvana means extinguishing a fire. There's two uses of the words. First, there's the nirvana that's experienced by one who is enlightened but still alive. And when he was talking to the ascetics, this was the kind of nirvana he was talking about. He said basically, stop fueling the fires that arise from sight, sound, and so on, and then you extinguish the clinging of aversion and delusion. And the second nirvana is the nirvana that happens after death. The way fire was viewed in the Buddha's time was kind of interesting. To burn, a fire has to have fuel. And the fire was felt to have this sort of agitated relationship to the fuel. It was bound to the fuel. And that binding itself was the agitation. When the fuel is used up, the fire is freed. It's unbound. So the word nirvana means extinguished, but it also means unbound. So if we want to free our minds, we have to stop clinging to the kinds of fuels that create our stress. As to the other nirvana, the post-death kind, the Buddha doesn't really describe that. And he sort of backs away from any descriptions of what nirvana is, and he deals with it more in terms of process. So, for example, there was a monk who came to the Buddha, and he said, what's your position on where an enlightened one goes after death? And the Buddha says, I don't have positions with regards to such things. He says, the question doesn't apply. And the monk now is even more confused than he was when he first asked the question. The Buddha says, look, if a fire were burning in front of you, would you know that there's a fire burning in front of you? And the monk said, well, of course. And suppose someone were to ask you, this fire, dependent on what is it burning? And the monk would say, well, the fire burns dependent on grass and timber as its sustenance. Well, if a fire were to go out, would you know that? Well, yes. Suppose someone were to ask, this fire that has gone out, in which direction has it gone? East, west, north, or south? It doesn't apply, the monk said. Yes, you get it. Any fire burning dependent on sustenance of grass and timber, being unnourished from having consumed that sustenance and not being offered any other, goes out. So if you determine that there's something that you're doing that's fueling your anger, your greed, your delusion, if you stop feeding it that, it goes out. And then he says, a red, blue, or white lotus born in the water rises above the surface to stand with no water clinging to it. In the same way, the Tathagata dwells with unrestricted awareness. So that was the answer to the monk's question. So in this sense, fire becomes not only a metaphor for the suffering we experience itself, but also from liberation from it. But you can't have a really good fiery sermon without talking about the brimstone side of things too. Now, if I understand it correctly, brimstone it's either sulfur or it's hot volcanic rock, but it shows up in the Bible as being sort of a symbol of God's wrath. It periodically comes up from hell to rain down on people who have been kind of evil. And so when my parents talked about fire and brimstone sermons, they really meant sermons that threaten horrible punishments for sins. I don't think the Buddha ever really talked about brimstone. Divine wrath doesn't really come into play in the Buddhist system. In fact, consequences of negative karma aren't considered in terms of crime and punishment or sin and divine retribution. Karma really is cause and effect. You do good, you get a good result. You do bad, you get a bad result. Simple as that. However, the Buddha was not reluctant to talk about negative and even hellish karmic results for evil behavior. He was especially rough on people he felt weren't sincere about living the holy life. Monks that didn't really take their practice seriously. So for example, one time the Buddha was traveling with a large number of monks, almost 200 of them, and they came upon a hot blazing fire, a really big fire. And the Buddha pointed to the fire and asked, "So what do you think, monks? Which would be better? To embrace that great mass of blazing fire, or to embrace a beautiful woman?" Well, that sounds like kind of a stupid question. But these were monks, and he was trying to make a point. And he said, "Let me tell you, monks," and I can almost hear a little Baptist preacher thing coming up in his voice as he's doing this. He says, "Let me tell you, monks, for one who is of poor conduct, an evil-minded one who pretends to lead the holy life, but is inwardly putrid and impure, it would be far better to embrace that mass of fire." I imagine the monks were quite surprised by this. But he explained that to embrace that fire would be painful, might even be fatal, but that passes quickly. Whereas to pretend to lead the holy life when really inwardly they would be leading lives of impurity, that would be much more painful, have much farther reaching consequences. And he said, for such a one, there is a long period of harm and pain. And on the breakup of body after death, he would be reborn into a realm of misery, a place of woe, a place of suffering. And then, as if that's not enough, he continues and describes a number of increasingly dramatic and gruesome tortures. And he says, what would be better, to be tortured or to enjoy support from rich householders, or to enjoy the prayer from supporters, to accept robes from people who expect you to be good monks, to accept alms offered by people who are coming to you for religious guidance and do it with an impure heart. He says it would be better to suffer the torture than to accept those offerings of faith insincerely. So he says these monks should carefully and diligently train their minds and live the holy life, seeing that for your own benefit it is right to strive with heedfulness, and for the benefit of others it is right to strive with heedfulness. So, according to the sutra, at this point, about 60 of the monks gave up. Disrobed, went back home, said, this is too hard. About 60 of them were enlightened. So, this idea of hell is a little troublesome to us. I mean, we tend not to believe in hells anymore as literal places, or, in devils and demons. There's kind of a Satan figure in Buddhism who comes up, and even very traditional Asian Buddhists see Mara as not as a demon or a deity, but as a personification of our own temptations and our own clinging. The thing that gets us to do the things that cause suffering for ourselves and others. And it's kind of useful and not uncommon at all to think of heavens and hells in terms of mental states and the consequences of our mental states. I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but there's another sutra about the divine messengers that I think I've mentioned before, but I want to talk about it again. The Buddha's talking about this guy who dies and he's reborn in a hell. And he's taken by the hell wardens to the King Yama. And the wardens say this man had no respect for mother and father, no reverence for holy men, no honor for high-ranking clansmen. Basically, he was just kind of a no-good guy. And King Yama starts to question him, and he says, well, didn't you see the divine messengers that were sent to you? And the man says, no, I didn't see any divine messengers. King says, well, didn't you see a newborn baby crying in pain and suffering? Well, yeah, I saw that. Well, didn't it occur to you that I too am subject to birth? I've not gone beyond birth. I'd better do good with body, speech, and mind. I said, well, no, I wasn't paying that much attention. The king says, well, what about this? Didn't you see a sick man, an old man, a criminal being punished, a corpse? And again, the man says, yeah, well, I saw that. Oh, that was a divine messenger? Well, I wasn't paying that much attention. It didn't occur to me that meant I should do good. So King Yama says, through your heedlessness, you did not do what was good with body, speech, and mind. You did evil karma, and you will experience its result. So the result would probably have shocked Dante a little bit. The hell wardens dragged the guy down for several eons of punishment involving red-hot irons and axes and being dragged over hot coals behind carriages, and then they throw him into the great hell. Which is, 100 leagues around with 4 walls and 4 gates, but the gates all lead to someplace worse, and so he's there for a long time, and then finally he goes to some lesser hells, like the hell of excrement, and the hell where the trees have blazing thorns, and the hell where the trees have leaves that have, they're like swords, and, all these kinds of things, and eventually he uses up his evil karma. I don't think we need to start believing that there are hells, but I do think that we do ourselves a disservice if we disregard these teachings altogether. So you think about his instructions to the monks. It's easy to say, well, that doesn't really apply to me. I'm not a monk. But think about it. What are the consequences of hypocrisy? If you live a life of hypocrisy and how far your actions reach, to what does that extend? What's the effect of us on the lives of others and on our own spiritual lives if we profess to be Buddhist or to embrace the concepts of Unitarianism, and yet inwardly we cling to views that cause suffering for ourselves and other people? The Buddha never said that we had to be perfect, but I think when he talked about heavens and hells, he wanted us to realize that heavens come about as a consequence of training our minds, and hell is the offspring of heedlessness. If we ignore the warnings of the Deva messengers who come our way and overlook the realities that we're born into all kinds of cycles of suffering, and heedlessness perpetuates that suffering, then what are its consequences? We hear descriptions of awful torments, but we create hells full of brimstone when we ignore the suffering around us and when we don't heed the ways we create stress for ourselves. But if we can pay attention to the workings of our own minds, if we are heedful of the Deva messengers that cross our paths, we can stop fueling the fires of suffering and thus hopefully experience the heaven of unbinding. Thank you. Warned by the Deva messengers of birth, of illness, of suffering, of death, those who are heedless enter a lower state and thus grieve for a long time. But those who are good, people of integrity, when warned by those messengers, are not heedless of the noble Dharma ever. Seeing danger and clinging in the coming into play of birth and death, they are released, happy, fully unbound in the here and now. Having gone beyond animosity and danger, they have escaped all suffering, all stress. We surround all people in all forms of life with love and compassion. Particularly, we send forth loving thoughts to those in suffering and sorrow, to all those in doubt and ignorance, to all who are striving to attain truth. May the infinite light of wisdom and compassion so shine within us that the errors and vanities of self may be dispelled, and so shall we understand the changing nature of existence and awaken into spiritual peace. To all enlightened ones who are present in their teachings, we pledge our loyalty and devotion. We dedicate our lives to the way of life they have laid down for us to walk. We resolve to follow their example and labor earnestly for the enlightenment and welfare of all beings.